In a meadow outside Frederick, Maryland, on the 13th of September, 1862, 3 cigars lay in the grass, wrapped in paper. The paper was not trash. It was not personal correspondence. It was a military order copied, signed, and distributed 5 days prior to the commanding officers of the Army of Northern Virginia. On it, the complete disposition of General Robert Edward Lee's forces. Their routes, their objectives, their separation. One copy had gone missing. Corporal Barton W. Mitchell of the 27th Indiana Volunteer Infantry picked it up. He read it. He passed it to his sergeant. The sergeant passed it to his captain. The captain passed it to his colonel. The colonel passed it to division. The division passed it to corps. Corps delivered it to the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac. By nightfall, Major General George Brinton McClellan held in his hands what no opposing commander in the war had ever possessed: total knowledge of his enemy's plan. What followed was not inevitable. It was chosen. And the choices made over the next 4 days transformed a lost piece of paper into the bloodiest single day in American military history. This is the story of Special Order 191. The Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River into Maryland on September 4, 1862. 55,000 men, 150 artillery pieces, miles of supply wagons. They forded at White's Ford, north of Leesburg, Virginia, in a crossing that took 2 full days. The water ran low that summer. Men waded waist-deep, holding rifles and cartridge boxes above their heads. Horses struggled with the current. Wagons bogged in the mud of the western bank. The army did so in the aftermath of victory. 1 month earlier, General Lee had defeated Major General John Pope at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Pope's army, battered, disorganized, had retreated into the fortified perimeter around Washington. The Confederate offensive, once purely defensive in nature, had turned into a knocked invasion. The initiative belonged to the South. Lee's objective was not the capture of Washington. The capital's defenses were too strong, its garrison too large. His objective was operational momentum. He sought to draw the war into Union territory, threaten Northern morale before the autumn congressional elections, force a redeployment of federal forces from other theaters, and if circumstances aligned, secure diplomatic recognition from European powers who had been watching the conflict with interest. Britain and France both relied on Southern cotton. A major Confederate victory on Northern soil might tip their calculations toward intervention. The Army of Northern Virginia was lean. It was undersupplied. It was moving into hostile ground where foraging would be difficult and local support uncertain. The men who crossed the Potomac were not the men who had begun the war. These were veterans. They had fought on the peninsula. They had fought in the Shenandoah Valley. They had fought at Second Bull Run. They understood field movement. They understood Confederate tactics. They also understood hunger. Many marched barefoot. The Army's Quartermaster Corps had collapsed under the strain of the previous month's campaigning. Shoe production in the South could not keep pace with losses. Thousands of men wrapped their feet in rags or strips of canvas cut from tents. Some marched barefoot on roads that had been baked hard by summer heat. Rations were irregular. The Army carried minimal supplies. Lee's strategy depended on living off the land. But Maryland, though a slave state, had remained in the Union. Its population was divided. Some counties sympathized with the Confederacy, others did not. Foraging parties met resistance. Farmers hid livestock. Supplies were purchased with Confederate scrip, which few merchants accepted. Hunger became routine. Discipline, while intact, showed strain. Desertion rates had climbed during the Maryland March. Thousands of men, particularly those from the Deep South who had enlisted to defend their home states, refused to invade the North. They saw the cause as defensive, not offensive. They dropped from the ranks by the hundreds. Some returned to Virginia. Some simply went home. Officers could not stop the hemorrhaging. By September 9, Lee's effective strength had dropped to approximately 55,000 men from the 75,000 who had fought at Second Bull Run 3 weeks earlier. The army was stretched. Not broken, but thin. Lee's plan required division. His immediate target was the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The town sat at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, wedged into a narrow valley surrounded by steep heights. It was a strategic rail and supply hub, controlling the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and the road network connecting the Shenandoah Valley to Maryland and Pennsylvania. The garrison, approximately 12,500 Federal troops under Colonel Dixon Stansbury Miles, sat squarely across Lee's supply line back to Virginia. He could not leave it intact. He could not bypass it without risking isolation. He had to take it. But Harper's Ferry's position was strong. It could not be stormed frontally. Its defenses, earthworks, artillery batteries, infantry positions covered all approaches from the valley floor. The only way to take it was to occupy the surrounding heights and bombard it into submission. That required a coordinated, multi-column movement from 3 directions simultaneously. To accomplish this, Lee would split his army into 4 separate columns. On September 9, 1862, Lee issued Special Order 191 from his headquarters near Frederick, Maryland. The order was detailed. It was comprehensive. It outlined the movement of his entire force for the next 5 days. Major General Thomas Jonathan Jackson, Stonewall. Jackson, commander of 3 divisions totaling approximately 14,000 men, would march west from Frederick, cross the Potomac, back into Virginia at Williamsport, then turn south and approach Harper's Ferry from the west and south, sealing off any retreat into the Shenandoah Valley. Major General Lafayette McLaws, commanding a division of approximately 7,000 men, along with Brigadier General Richard Heron Anderson's division of 4,000, would move southwest from Frederick toward Maryland Heights, the dominant ridge overlooking Harper's Ferry from the north. Once secured, McLaws would position artillery on the heights and enfilade the Federal garrison below. Brigadier General John George Walker, commanding a division of approximately 3,500 men, would cross the Potomac back into Virginia at Point of Rocks, then move west to seize Loudon Heights, the ridge overlooking Harper's Ferry from the southeast. This would complete the encirclement and provide a 3rd artillery position. Major General James Longstreet, commanding the Army's largest corps of approximately 18,000 men, would move north from Frederick toward Hagerstown with the reserve artillery and the Army's wagon train. This movement would threaten Pennsylvania, draw attention away from Harper's Ferry, and position the Army to either support the siege or continue the advance northward if Harper's Ferry fell quickly. Major General Daniel Harvey Hill, commanding a division of approximately 5,000 men, would act as rear guard. His division would follow Longstreet's line of march at a 1-day interval, protecting the Army's communication line and screening against any pursuit from the direction of Washington. The plan was bold. It exploited interior lines. It used terrain intelligently. It relied on speed and coordination. It was also dangerous. For at least 4 days, possibly 5, Lee's army would be dispersed across more than 40 miles of Maryland and Virginia territory. No single column would be within supporting distance of another. Jackson's force, once across the Potomac, would be separated from Lee's main body by 30 miles and a river crossing. McLaws would be isolated on Maryland Heights, vulnerable to attack from any Union force approaching from the east. Walker, in Virginia, would be cut off entirely if Union forces seized the Potomac crossings. If the Union Army of the Potomac discovered the plan, it could defeat the Confederate columns in detail, destroying them one at a time before they could concentrate. Lee accepted this risk, based on 2 assumptions. First, he believed the Army of the Potomac was still reorganizing around Washington. Major General McClellan had been restored to command only days earlier after Pope's failure. The Army's morale was low. Its logistical situation was chaotic. McClellan would need time to re-establish order, consolidate his forces, and prepare an offensive. Second, Lee believed McClellan would move cautiously. McClellan's reputation preceded him. He was methodical. He was careful. He consistently overestimated enemy strength. He disliked risk. Lee calculated that even if McClellan began moving from Washington, he would advance slowly, probe carefully, and hesitate before committing to battle. This would give Lee the time he needed to take Harper's Ferry and reunite his army before any engagement. Special Order 191 was copied by hand. This was standard practice in 1862. No typewriters existed in field headquarters. Orders were written in longhand by staff officers, then copied as many times as necessary for distribution to subordinate commanders. Multiple copies were prepared. The exact number is uncertain. At minimum, 7 copies were made, 1 for each major commander, 1 for headquarters files, 1 for Lieutenant General Jackson as overall commander of the Harper's Ferry operation, 1 for Major General Longstreet, 1 for Major General McLaws, 1 for Brigadier General Walker, 1 for Major General Hill, and 1 for Cavalry Commander Major General James Ewell Brown Stewart. The distribution process was not formalized. Couriers carried the orders. Some were delivered by hand, some were sent via cavalry escort, some were received the same day, some took 2 days to arrive. There was no acknowledgement system, no receipt confirmation. An order was sent. It was assumed to be received. Somewhere in that process, a copy went missing. No one noticed. The order delivered to Major General Hill became the subject of later dispute. Hill claimed he never received a direct copy of Special Order 191. He stated he learned of the plan through Lieutenant General Jackson, his immediate superior for the Harper's Ferry operation, who briefed him verbally. Lee's staff claimed a copy had been prepared and sent to Hill's headquarters. The discrepancy was never resolved. 1 copy existed. 1 copy was sent. 1 copy disappeared. On September 10, the Confederate columns began their movements. Jackson's 3 divisions, his own under Brigadier General John Robert Jones, Major General Richard Stoddert Ewell's division under Brigadier General Alexander Robert Lawton, and Major General Ambrose Powell Hill's Light Division crossed the Potomac at Williamsport. The crossing took most of the day. By evening, all 3 divisions were in Virginia, bivouacked near Martinsburg. McLaw's column moved southwest from Frederick toward Maryland Heights. Progress was slow. The roads were narrow. Wagon traffic congested the march. By evening, McLaw's had covered only 8 miles. Walker's division moved south toward Point of Rocks. They reached the Potomac by evening but did not cross. The ford was deeper than expected. Walker decided to wait for morning light. Longstreet's corps moved north toward Boonesboro, a small town 13 miles northwest of Frederick. The march was unopposed. By evening, Longstreet's lead elements had reached Boonesboro. The wagon train stretched for miles behind. Hill's division remained near Frederick, screening the army's rear. No Union forces had appeared. The countryside was quiet. Lee himself moved with Longstreet toward Boonesboro. His headquarters traveled with the main column. Communication with the other columns was maintained by courier. By September 11, the army was fully dispersed. Jackson's divisions reached Martinsburg. The small Union garrison, approximately 2,500 men, evacuated without resistance and withdrew toward Harper's Ferry. Jackson continued south, approaching Harper's Ferry from the west. McLaws reached the base of Maryland Heights. His division began the ascent on September 12. The climb was steep. Artillery could not be brought up. Infantry scrambled through dense forest, hauling ammunition by hand. Federal defenders, a brigade of approximately 1,600 men, occupied entrenchments near the summit. Fighting began in late afternoon. By nightfall, McLaws had not reached the crest. Walker crossed the Potomac at Point of Rocks on September 11. His division moved west along the Virginia bank, reaching the base of Loudon Heights by evening on September 12. The ascent began the following morning. No Federal forces opposed him. By midday on September 13, Walker's artillery occupied the heights. Longstreet reached Hagerstown on September 11. The town, just 7 miles from the Pennsylvania border, was undefended. Longstreet's corps went into camp. Foraging parties spread into the countryside. Supplies were limited. The men rested. Hill's division followed Longstreet's route, moving through Boonesboro on September 12. By evening, Hill had reached the eastern base of South Mountain, the long ridge separating the Cumberland Valley from the Piedmont. Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap, the two main passes through South Mountain, lay directly ahead. Hill's division went into bivouac near the gaps. Pickets were posted. The night was quiet. By September 12, the Confederate Army's dispersal was complete. The distance between Lee at Hagerstown and Jackson approaching Harper's Ferry exceeded 30 miles. The distance between McLaws on Maryland Heights and Walker on Loudon Heights exceeded 15 miles, with the Federal garrison between them. No single Confederate force could reach another in less than a full day's march. If attacked, each column would fight alone. The Army of the Potomac, meanwhile, had begun moving northwest from Washington. Major General McClellan, commanding approximately 87,000 men organized into 6 corps, had received his orders on September 5. His mission: pursue Lee, force battle, and destroy the Army of Northern Virginia before it could threaten Pennsylvania or disrupt Northern morale. McClellan moved slowly. His intelligence was incomplete. Cavalry scouts reported Confederate forces moving northwest from Frederick, but strength estimates varied wildly. McClellan's intelligence chief, Detective Allen Pinkerton, estimated Lee commanded between 90,000 and 120,000 men, nearly double the actual figure. McClellan believed he was outnumbered. He advanced cautiously. The army moved in 3 columns. Major General William Buell Franklin's 6 Corps advanced along the southern route toward the Potomac. Major General Edwin Vaugh's Sumner's 2 Corps and Major General Joseph Hooker's 1 Corps advanced along the central route toward Frederick. Major General Ambrose Everett Burnside's 9th Corps followed in reserve. The remaining Corps, V Corps, under Major General Fitzjohn Porter, and the 12th Corps, under Major General Joseph King Fenno Mansfield, marched in support. The pace averaged 10 miles per day. This was not unusual for the period, but it was not aggressive. Lee's army, marching divided and undersupplied, covered similar distances despite being in worse condition. By September 12, McClellan's lead elements, Hooker's Corps, reached the outskirts of Frederick. Confederate rearguard cavalry under Major General Stuart withdrew from the city that morning. A small skirmish occurred on the Frederick Road. No infantry engaged. Stuart's troopers fell back toward South Mountain, reporting to Lee that Union forces were entering Frederick. Lee received the report on September 12. He was not alarmed. McClellan was moving as expected, slowly, carefully, without urgency. Jackson had not yet taken Harper's Ferry, but the siege was nearly complete. McLaws had reached Maryland Heights. Walker occupied Loudon Heights. The Federal garrison was surrounded. Lee estimated surrender would occur within 24 to 48 hours. Once Harper's Ferry fell, Jackson would march north with all speed. The army would reunite near Sharpsburg or Boonesboro. McClellan would arrive to find a concentrated force ready for battle. Lee's plan was proceeding, and then, on the morning of September 13, everything changed. The 27th Indiana Volunteer Infantry reached Frederick on the morning of September 13, 1862. The regiment was part of Brigadier General Alpheus Starkey Williams' Division, 12 Corps, Army of the Potomac. It was not a distinguished unit. It was not a veteran formation. Raised in the autumn of 1861 from recruits in Wayne, Randolph, and Henry counties in eastern Indiana, the 27th had seen limited combat. Its first engagement had been at Winchester in May 1862, a confused, small-scale action during the Shenandoah Valley Campaign. Since then, the regiment had performed garrison and picket duties around Washington. Its soldiers were farmers, mechanics, tradesmen, Midwestern volunteers, unused to the dense forests, summer humidity, and political tensions of Maryland. The regiment numbered approximately 900 men. It was organized into 10 companies, lettered A through K. Company F, commanded by Captain Peter Kopp, was typical. 85 enlisted men, 3 officers, 1 first sergeant, 4 sergeants, 8 corporals. Most had never fired their rifles in combat. Most had never seen more than a skirmish line at a distance. They bivouacked in a meadow on the northern edge of Frederick, just beyond the town limits. The location had been occupied days earlier by Confederate forces, specifically elements of Major General Hill's division, which had camped there on September 10 and 11 before withdrawing towards South Mountain. The meadow showed signs of recent use. Grass had been trampled flat in patterns indicating tent rows, cold fire pits dotted the ground, scattered refuse scraps of paper, broken equipment, empty cartridge boxes lay in the underbrush. A split-rail fence marked the meadow's southern boundary. Beyond it, the national road stretched west toward the mountains. Corporal Barton W. Mitchell, Company F, sat in the shade of a tree near the fence line. He was 23 years old. Before the war, he had worked as a laborer in Wayne County. He had enlisted in August 1861, motivated by the call for volunteers following the Union defeat at Bull Run. He had no formal education beyond basic literacy. He had no military training prior to enlistment. He held no ambitions for promotion. He performed his duties quietly and competently. His service record listed no disciplinary actions and no commendations. It was late morning. The regiment had marched 13 miles from their previous bivouac near Urbana. The day was warm. Orders had been given to rest in place. Pickets had been posted. The men settled into routine, cleaning rifles, writing letters, cooking rations. Mitchell noticed the cigars first. 3 cigars, bound together with a piece of paper. They lay in the grass approximately 15 feet from the fence line, near where Mitchell had laid down his knapsack. Cigars were valuable. Tobacco supplies in the Army of the Potomac were irregular. Soldiers treasured them. Mitchell picked them up. The cigars were of moderate quality, not expensive, but not cheap, hand-rolled, still fresh. Someone had lost them recently within the past 2 or 3 days, judging by their condition. The paper wrapping them was not standard cigar packaging, it was folded correspondence. Mitchell unfolded it. The paper was clean, unsoiled. It measured approximately 8 inches by 10 inches. Standard letter-size stationery. Writing covered one side, in clear, formal hand. Military format. Official language. Mitchell read the heading, Headquarters, Army of Northern Virginia, Special Orders No. 191, September 9, 1862. He read further. The document was organized into numbered paragraphs. Each paragraph detailed specific movements for a named Confederate division or corps. Routes were listed. Timetables were specified. Objectives were stated. Paragraph 1. General Jackson's command would proceed to Martinsburg, capture or drive out the Union forces there, then move to invest Harper's Ferry. Paragraph 2. General Longstreet's command would proceed to Boonesboro. Paragraph 3. General McClellan's command would take Maryland Heights, commanding Harper's Ferry. Paragraph 4. General Walker's command would take Loudon Heights, commanding Harper's Ferry from the south. Paragraph 5. General Hill's division would act as rear guard. The document continued for 10 paragraphs. It concluded with a signature line, by command of General R. E. Lee, R. H. Chilton, Assistant Adjutant General. Mitchell did not discard it. He did not dismiss it as a forgery or a ruse. He understood immediately that it was authentic. The formatting was correct, the language was formal, the details were specific. This was not a captured prisoner's statement or a deserter's story. This was an order. He brought it to First Sergeant John McKnight Bloss. Company F. Bloss was 31 years old. He had worked as a clerk before the war. He had education. He understood military procedures. He read the document carefully. He recognized its significance immediately. This was not routine intelligence. This was the Confederate Army's operational plan, complete, detailed, current. Bloss brought it to Captain Peter Kopp, the regimental adjutant. Kopp was 34 years old. He had been born in Germany, immigrated to the United States as a child, and settled in Indiana. Before the war, he had served in the regular United States Army as an enlisted man, stationed at frontier posts in the West. He had seen service. He understood Army procedures. More importantly, he had served with regular Army officers who were now serving in the Confederate Army. Copp read the document. He studied the signature R. H. Chilton. Copp knew that name. Colonel Robert Hall Chilton had been a regular Army officer before the war, serving as a major in the Paymaster's Department. When Virginia seceded, Chilton had resigned his commission and joined the Confederate Army. He had been appointed Assistant Adjutant General on Lee's staff. Copp had known Chilton personally during his regular Army service. He recognized the handwriting. He recognized the signature style. This was authentic. Copp brought the document to Colonel Silas Colgrove, commanding officer of the 27th Indiana. Colgrove read it. He forwarded it to Brigadier General Williams, division commander. Williams read it. He recognized its significance immediately and forwarded it directly to Major General McClellan's headquarters at Frederick. 12. Corps Commander Major General Joseph K. F. Mansfield was forward with other elements of the Corps. Given the document's urgency, Williams bypassed normal Corps channels and sent it directly to Army headquarters. By this point, it was late morning. Approximately 4 hours had elapsed since Mitchell had found the document. By this point, it was afternoon. Approximately 4 hours had elapsed since Mitchell had found the document. The document arrived at Major General McClellan's headquarters at noon. McClellan was meeting with his staff when the document was delivered. It was handed to him by one of Williams' staff officers, who explained the circumstances. Found wrapped around cigars, verified as authentic by an officer who knew Chilton personally, discovered in a bivouac recently occupied by Confederate II forces. McClellan read it. For 12 minutes he sat in silence, studying the paper. He cross-referenced it with maps spread across his headquarters table. He called for his intelligence chief, Allen Pinkerton. He called for his chief of staff, Major General Randolph Barnes Marcy. He called for several officers who had served in the pre-war regular army and might recognize Chilton's handwriting. All confirmed authenticity. McClellan now possessed the following information. The Army of Northern Virginia, as of September 9, had been divided into 4 widely separated columns. 4 days had passed since the order was issued. The movements would be well underway. Jackson would be near or at Harper's Ferry. McLaws would be on Maryland Heights. Walker would be on Loudon Heights. Longstreet would be near Hagerstown or Boonesboro. Hill would be somewhere between Frederick and Boonesboro, screening the Army's rear. The distances were precise. Jackson was at least 30 miles from Lee's main body. McLaws was isolated on a ridge with the Potomac River behind him. Walker was in Virginia, cut off. Hill was exposed on the eastern slope of South Mountain with no support within a day's march. The Confederate Army was fragmented. It could not concentrate for at least 2 days, possibly 3. If McClellan moved immediately, if he drove through South Mountain and engaged the separated columns before they could reunite, he could destroy Lee's army in detail. This was the opportunity every general sought. A divided enemy, isolated in enemy territory, with no avenue of retreat. McClellan's response was immediate. He drafted orders for all corps commanders. The army would advance at dawn on September 14. The objective: penetrate South Mountain, engage and destroy Confederate forces beyond, and relieve the garrison at Harper's Ferry before it could be taken. Major General Franklin's V Corps, positioned south of Frederick, would march immediately toward Crampton's Gap, the southernmost pass through South Mountain. Once through the gap, Franklin would descend into Pleasant Valley, engage McLaws from the rear, drive him off Maryland Heights, and relieve Harper's Ferry from the north. This was a distance of approximately 15 miles. Franklin had 18,000 men. McLaws had 11,000, isolated on a ridge. Major General Burnside's IX Corps and Major General Hooker's I Corps, positioned at Frederick, would advance west toward Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap, the central passes through South Mountain. Once through, they would engage Longstreet and Hill, prevent their retreat, and drive toward Hagerstown. This force totaled approximately 28,000 men. Confederate forces at the gaps numbered perhaps 5,000. Major General Sumner's II Corps would follow in support. Major General Porter's V Corps would remain in reserve. The advance would begin in 18 hours. McClellan sent a telegram to President Lincoln at 12:45 p.m. "I have all the plans of the rebels, and will catch them in their own trap if my men are equal to the emergency. I think Lee has made a gross mistake, and that he will be severely punished for it." The message was confident. The plan was sound. The opportunity was real. But 18 hours was not immediate. 18 hours allowed time for word to spread. 18 hours allowed time for couriers to ride. 18 hours allowed time for Lee to learn what had happened. And in those 18 hours, Lee did learn. The exact source of the warning is uncertain. Records are incomplete. 3 possibilities exist. First, a Confederate sympathizer in Frederick observed the Union response. McClellan's headquarters became a hub of activity after noon on September 13. Couriers rode in all directions. Orders were drafted urgently. Staff officers moved with purpose. This activity would have been visible to anyone watching. A sympathetic civilian or a Confederate spy operating in Frederick could have inferred that something significant had occurred. Second, Confederate cavalry scouts observed the Union Army's sudden change in posture. Major General Stuart's cavalry had been screening the Confederate rear. His troopers watched the approaches to South Mountain. On the afternoon of September 13, Union forces began preparing for movement. Camps were struck earlier than usual. Regiments formed for march. Artillery limbered guns. This change in routine would have been observable to Confederate scouts, who reported immediately to Stuart. Stuart would have sent word to Lee, "The enemy is preparing to advance aggressively, earlier than expected." Third, a captured Union soldier revealed the discovery under interrogation. This possibility is mentioned in some post-war accounts, but is not verified by contemporary records. Whatever the source, Lee received word on the evening of September 13 that McClellan had obtained detailed knowledge of Confederate movements. Lee understood the implications immediately. If McClellan knew the plan, he would exploit it. He would move quickly for once. He would strike before the army could reunite. Lee's dispersed columns would be vulnerable to defeat in detail. Lee's options narrowed to 2. Option 1. Order an immediate general withdrawal back across the Potomac into Virginia. Recall all columns. Abandon the Maryland campaign. Accept defeat without battle. This would save the army, but destroy Confederate momentum and morale. It would surrender the initiative. It would be seen as retreat under pressure. Option 2. Accelerate operations at Harper's Ferry. Hold South Mountain against any Union advance, and concentrate the army as rapidly as possible for battle. This was risky. It assumed Jackson could take Harper's Ferry within 24 hours. It assumed Hill and Longstreet could hold South Mountain long enough for the army to reunite. It assumed the men exhausted, hungry, depleted could force-march dozens of miles and fight immediately upon arrival. Lee chose option 2. He drafted urgent orders and dispatched them by courier that night. To Lieutenant General Jackson, "The enemy is moving more rapidly than anticipated. Take Harper's Ferry immediately. Use all available force. Upon its fall, march north with all speed." To Major General McLaws, "Enemy forces may attempt to relieve Harper's Ferry from the east. Hold Maryland Heights at all costs. Coordinate with General Jackson for the garrison's immediate reduction." To Major General Longstreet, "Return to Boonesboro. Prepare to support General Hill at South Mountain." To Major General Hill, "Enemy will likely advance against South Mountain tomorrow. Hold Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap until the army can concentrate." The couriers rode through the night. Jackson received his order at dawn on September 14. He tightened the siege immediately. Artillery on all 3 heights opened coordinated fire on the Federal garrison. Confederate infantry moved forward. Sharpshooters engaged Federal positions. The bombardment intensified. McLaws received his order on the morning of September 14. He reinforced his positions on Maryland Heights. His artillery began systematically destroying Federal positions in Harper's Ferry below. Longstreet received his order at dawn on September 14. His corps rested, fed, supplied, began the 15-mile march back toward Boonesboro. They moved quickly. By mid-afternoon, Longstreet's lead elements would reach Turner's Gap. Hill received his order late on September 13. He moved his division into defensive positions along South Mountain that night. By dawn on September 14, Hill's 5,000 men occupied the ridges overlooking Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap. By midday on September 14, both armies were in motion. The race had begun. South Mountain is not a single ridge. It is a long, uneven massif running north-south through western Maryland for approximately 50 miles. The ridgeline varies in height from 1,000 to 1,800 feet above the surrounding valleys. Dense deciduous forest covers most slopes. Rock outcroppings break through the canopy on steeper sections. Water sources are limited to small streams in the valleys below. 3 gaps cut through South Mountain in the area of operations: Crampton's Gap to the south, Turner's Gap in the center, and Fox's Gap immediately south of Turner's. Each gap was a natural bottleneck. Roads through the gaps were narrow, steep, winding. Artillery could move through, but only with difficulty. Infantry could deploy on the slopes, but visibility would be limited. Defenders holding the high ground would have significant advantages. On the morning of September 14, 1862, Major General Daniel Harvey Hill held those gaps with approximately 5,000 men. Hill was 41 years old. A North Carolinian, he had graduated from West Point in 1842, served in the Mexican War, then resigned from the Army in 1849 to become a mathematics professor. When North Carolina seceded, he rejoined the military, receiving command of a regiment, then a brigade, then a division. He had fought on the peninsula. He had fought at Second Bull Run. He understood defense. He understood terrain. He understood how to make small numbers fight effectively against larger forces. Hill understood his assignment. He was not expected to win. He was expected to delay. Hold the gaps long enough for Lee to concentrate the army. Hours mattered. A single day of delay could mean survival. 2 days would allow Jackson to arrive from Harper's Ferry with 14,000 men. 3 days would allow McLaws and Walker to arrive as well. Hill deployed his forces carefully. Brigadier General Samuel Garland Jr.'s brigade, 5 North Carolina regiments, totaling approximately 1,000 men, occupied Fox's Gap, the southernmost position. Garland placed his regiments in a curved defensive line along the eastern slope of the gap. The left flank anchored on a stone wall running north-south through a wooded ravine. The center occupied a cornfield with a farmhouse, the Wise farmhouse, at its northern edge. The right flank extended into dense forest. Artillery could not be positioned. The terrain was too steep. Infantry would fight alone. Brigadier General Robert E. Rhodes' brigade, 5 Alabama regiments, totaling approximately 1,200 men, occupied Turner's Gap, 1 mile north of Fox's Gap. Rhodes deployed his men along the National Road where it crested the ridge. This was the primary route through South Mountain. If Union forces intended to pursue Lee toward Hagerstown, they would use this road. Rhodes placed regiments on both sides of the road, occupying stone walls and earthworks left from earlier militia use. Confederate artillery, 2 batteries totaling 12 guns unlimbered on commanding ground overlooking the eastern approach. Brigadier General Alfred Holt. Colquitt's brigade, approximately 1,100 men, deployed north of Turner's Gap as a flank guard. Colquitt's mission was to prevent Union forces from turning the Confederate right. Hill held 2 brigades in reserve: Brigadier General Roswell Sabine Ripley's brigade and Brigadier General George Burgwin Anderson's brigade, totaling approximately 1,700 men. These were positioned west of the gaps, ready to reinforce any threatened point. The defensive line was thin. 5,000 men could not hold a 5-mile ridgeline against determined assault. But they did not need to hold indefinitely. They needed to hold until Longstreet arrived. The Union advance began at dawn. Major General Burnside, commanding IX Corps, received orders at 6 a.m., advance west from Frederick, seize Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap, engage Confederate forces beyond, prevent their retreat. Burnside commanded 3 divisions totaling approximately 13,000 men. He also controlled Hooker's I Corps, another 14,000 men which would advance in support. Burnside moved cautiously. His lead division, under Brigadier General Jacob Dolson Cox, departed Frederick at 7 a.m. Cox's column marched west on the National Road toward Turner's Gap. Progress was slow. The road was congested with supply wagons from previous units. Frequent halts disrupted the march. At 9 a.m., Cox's advance guard, the 23rd Ohio Infantry under Lieutenant Colonel Rutherford Burchard Hayes, encountered Confederate pickets 2 miles east of Turner's Gap. Shots were exchanged. The pickets fell back. Hayes deployed his regiment into line and advanced. Cox, receiving word of contact, halted the column. He sent staff officers forward to reconnoiter. They reported Confederate forces occupying the heights ahead in unknown strength. Cox decided not to assault Turner's Gap frontally. The position was too strong. Instead, he would flank it from the south by seizing Fox's Gap first. At 9:30 a.m., Cox sent Colonel Eliakim Parker Scammon's brigade 4 regiments, totaling approximately 3,000 men southwest through fields and forest toward Fox's Gap. Scammon's men left the road and began ascending the mountain through rough terrain. No trails existed. Guides from the local area led the way. Progress was slow. By 11 a.m., Scammon's lead regiments, the 23rd Ohio and 12th Ohio, reached the eastern slope of Fox's Gap. They encountered Garland's skirmish line in the woods below the Wise Farm. The fighting began immediately. Confederate skirmishers opened fire from tree lines. Union infantry deployed from column into line, a slow process in dense forest. Company officers shouted orders. Regimental flags marked positions. Men scrambled for cover behind trees and rocks. Return fire began. The engagement was close range, confused, fragmented. Colonel Hayes, commanding the 23rd Ohio, pushed his regiment forward. They reached the Wise Farm cornfield and entered it. The corn was head high, fully grown, ready for harvest. Visibility dropped to feet. Confederate soldiers, the 23rd North Carolina Infantry, waited in the cornfield's far edge. The 23rd North Carolina rose and fired a volley at 50 yards. The 23rd Ohio recoiled. Hayes was shot in the left arm. Command passed to his second in command. The regiment took cover along the cornfield's eastern edge and returned fire. For 30 minutes, both sides exchanged volleys across the cornfield. Casualties mounted rapidly. Neither side could advance. Cox committed his 2nd Brigade, Colonel Hugh Boyle Ewing's brigade, another 4 regiments. Ewing's men entered the fight on the 23rd Ohio's left, extending the Union line south through the forest. Confederate fire intensified. Garland's brigade was outnumbered 3-1, but the terrain favored defense. Brigadier General Garland rode forward to observe the fighting. He reached his brigade's center, near the 20th North Carolina's position, at approximately noon. He was attempting to rally the regiment when he was struck by rifle fire. The bullet entered his chest. He fell from his horse. His staff carried him to the rear. He died within minutes. He was 31 years old. Garland's brigade began to unravel. Command passed to Colonel Duncan K. McCrae, but he could not restore order. Federal pressure increased. Union regiments overlapped the Confederate left flank. At 12:30 p.m., McCrae ordered a withdrawal. Garland's men fell back in disorder toward the Gap's western slope. Cox's men reached the crest of Fox's Gap at 1 p.m. 1 mile north, the fighting at Turner's Gap intensified. Major General Jesse Lee Reno, commanding IX Corps, arrived at the front at noon. He observed Cox's success at Fox's Gap and decided to press the assault at Turner's Gap simultaneously. If both gaps fell, Hill's entire defensive line would collapse. Reno committed Brigadier General Samuel Davis Sturgis's division, approximately 5,000 men, against Turner's Gap from the south. Sturgis deployed 2 brigades. They advanced up the mountain slopes through forest toward Rhodes' positions. The terrain was brutal. Slopes approached 30 degrees in places. Men climbed hand over hand, grabbing tree, branches for support. Artillery could not follow. Infantry carried only their rifles and cartridge boxes. Everything else was left behind. Confederate artillery opened fire from the ridge above. Shells burst in the trees. Shrapnel shredded foliage. Men dropped. The advance continued. Rhodes's infantry waited behind stone walls and earthworks along the ridgeline. They held fire until Union soldiers reached close range, less than 100 yards. Then they fired in organized volleys. The effect was devastating. Entire Union companies were swept away. Survivors took cover and returned fire. The fighting became static. For 2 hours, neither side could advance. At 2 p.m., Major General Longstreet arrived with the lead elements of his corps. Longstreet had force-marched 15 miles from Hagerstown. His men were tired but ready. He brought 3 brigades initially, Brigadier General David Rumph Jones's division, approximately 3,000 men. More were marching behind, expected to arrive within hours. Longstreet deployed Jones' brigades along the northern extension of the Confederate line, preventing any Union flanking movement from that direction. He also sent 1 brigade to reinforce Rhodes at Turner's Gap. The Confederate line solidified. At 3 p.m., General Robert E. Lee himself arrived at Turner's Gap. Lee had ridden from Hagerstown with Longstreet. He climbed the ridge and established a command post overlooking the battlefield. From there, he could observe the Union deployments below. The situation was precarious. His forces now numbered approximately 10,000 men, Hill's original division, plus Longstreet's arriving brigades. McClellan had committed at least 28,000 to the fighting, with more in reserve. Lee received reports throughout the afternoon. The news was mixed. Hill and Longstreet were holding their positions, but Union pressure was unrelenting. Cox had secured Fox's Gap. Union forces were pushing west from that position, threatening to turn the Confederate left. At Turner's Gap, Sturgis's division was making slow progress uphill, but had not broken through. More concerning was the situation at Crampton's Gap, 15 miles to the south. Major General Franklin's 6th Corps, 18,000 men, had advanced against Crampton's Gap at midday. The gap was defended by a single Confederate brigade under Brigadier General Howell Cobb, approximately 2,000 men. Franklin's lead division attacked at 3 p.m. By 4 p.m., Cobb's brigade had been overrun. Franklin's corps poured through the gap into Pleasant Valley. McLaws, isolated on Maryland Heights with his back to the Potomac, was now threatened from the rear. Lee understood the situation. South Mountain could not be held indefinitely. Franklin was through Crampton's Gap. McLaws was in danger. If McLaws's force was destroyed, 1/5 of Lee's army would be lost. The entire campaign would collapse. But Harper's Ferry had not yet fallen. If Lee withdrew now, Jackson would be trapped. The siege would be abandoned. The garrison would escape. Lee needed time. Not days. Hours. He sent an urgent message to Jackson. Harper's Ferry must fall today. March north immediately upon its surrender. He ordered Hill and Longstreet to hold South Mountain until nightfall. They did. The fighting continued throughout the afternoon and into evening. Union forces gained ground slowly. Confederate defenders fell back from one position to another. Casualties mounted on both sides. By 6 p.m., Union forces controlled both Fox's Gap and Turner's Gap, but Confederate forces still held the western slopes. The gaps had been penetrated, but not fully cleared. At 8 p.m., darkness ended the fighting. Lee made his decision during the night. Harper's Ferry had not fallen. Jackson had sent word that the Federal garrison was on the verge of surrender, but negotiations were ongoing. The fall could happen at dawn, or it could take another day. Lee could not wait. South Mountain was lost. McClellan would renew the siege, assault at dawn with fresh troops. The position could not be held another day. Lee ordered a general withdrawal. At midnight, Confederate forces began pulling back from South Mountain. They moved west in the darkness, away from the gaps, toward the town of Sharpsburg, 17 miles distant. Hill's division led the withdrawal. Longstreet's corps followed. Artillery was evacuated first, then infantry. The movement was orderly but hurried. By dawn on September 15, South Mountain was abandoned. Union forces occupied the heights at first light. McClellan's army was through the barrier. The road to Hagerstown and to Lee's isolated columns lay open, but Lee was not retreating into Virginia. He was moving to Sharpsburg. He was concentrating his army for battle. He was gambling that Jackson would take Harper's Ferry in time. He was gambling that he could hold McClellan long enough for his dispersed forces to reunite. And at 8 a.m. on September 15, 30 miles to the south, that gamble paid off. Harper's Ferry surrendered. Colonel Dixon Stansbury Miles was 60 years old. A career army officer, he had served for nearly 4 decades. He had fought in the Mexican War. He had commanded troops on the frontier. He had been promoted steadily, reaching the rank of colonel by 1861. When the Civil War began, he remained loyal to the Union. He had also been court-martialed in 1861 for being drunk during the First Battle of Bull Run. He was found guilty and reprimanded. He received no further field commands. He was assigned to garrison duty. In September 1862, he commanded the Federal garrison at Harper's Ferry. Approximately 12,500 men organized into provisional brigades drawn from multiple regiments and several artillery batteries. The garrison's position was untenable. Harper's Ferry sat at the bottom of a deep valley. Maryland Heights rose 1,400 feet to the north. Loudon Heights rose 1,100 feet to the east, across the Shenandoah River, Bolivar. Heights, a low ridge west of town, provided the only defensive ground. Every position in the town itself was overlooked and enfiladed by the surrounding heights. Miles had been ordered to hold Harper's Ferry. He had not been ordered to evacuate if surrounded. He interpreted his orders literally. He would hold until ordered to withdraw or until holding became impossible. By September 13, holding had become impossible. Confederate forces surrounded the town on 3 sides. Jackson's 3 divisions occupied the high ground west of Bolivar Heights. McLaws' 2 divisions held Maryland Heights. Walker's division held Loudon Heights. 15 Confederate artillery batteries, more than 60 guns, commanded every approach, every position, every street. On September 13, Confederate artillery began systematic bombardment. Shells fell into the town from 3 directions. Federal artillery attempted to respond but could not reach the heights. Federal infantry could not assault uphill against prepared positions. The garrison was trapped. Miles held a council of war on the evening of September 13. His brigade commanders argued for immediate evacuation. They proposed a breakout to the northeast, toward Pennsylvania, before the Confederate encirclement tightened. Miles refused. He cited his orders: hold Harper's Ferry. He would not abandon his post without explicit authorization. On September 14, the bombardment intensified. Jackson tightened his lines. McLaws brought additional artillery onto Maryland Heights. Walker's guns on Loudon Heights began systematic shelling of Federal positions on Bolivar Heights. Casualties mounted. The town's buildings caught fire. Water supplies were disrupted. Ammunition reserves dropped. Miles still refused to surrender. He sent couriers to McClellan requesting relief. He believed Union forces advancing through South Mountain would reach Harper's Ferry within a day. He ordered his men to hold. On the night of September 14, a small Union cavalry force, approximately 1,300 troopers under Colonel Arno Voss and Colonel Benjamin Franklin Davis, broke through Confederate lines and escaped northward. They took the only route still open, a narrow road between the Potomac and the base of Maryland Heights, under cover of darkness. The breakout succeeded. The cavalry reached Federal lines near Greencastle, Pennsylvania, 2 days later, but 11,000 infantry remained trapped. On the morning of September 15, Jackson ordered a final, coordinated bombardment. All 60 Confederate guns opened fire simultaneously at dawn. Shells fell at a rate of 1 every 3 seconds. The bombardment lasted 4 hours. Federal positions on Bolivar Heights were systematically destroyed. Artillery was silenced. Infantry entrenchments were collapsed by direct hits. Casualties exceeded 200 men in the first hour. At 8 a.m., Miles requested terms. Jackson sent his adjutant, Captain Henry Kidd Douglas, under a white flag. The terms were simple: unconditional surrender. All federal troops would become prisoners of war. All weapons, equipment, and supplies would be seized. Officers would be paroled and released. Enlisted men would be held as prisoners until formally exchanged. Miles had no choice. He accepted. At 8 a.m. on September 15, 1862, approximately 12,500 Union soldiers laid down their arms. It was the largest surrender of United States military forces until the fall of Bataan in World War II. Jackson's men entered the town at 9 a.m. Confederate infantry occupied federal positions. Artillery was inventoried, 73 guns captured intact. Small arms were stacked in the streets, 13,000 rifles and muskets. Supply warehouses were opened, significant quantities of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and equipment. Colonel Miles did not witness the surrender's completion. During the final bombardment, a Confederate artillery shell exploded near his command post. Fragments struck him in the leg, severing the femoral artery. He was carried to a nearby building. He died at 1 p.m. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "I have done my duty." Jackson wasted no time. Lee's orders were explicit: march north immediately. The Army of Northern Virginia was concentrating at Sharpsburg. McClellan's army was through South Mountain. Every hour mattered. Jackson issued orders at 10 a.m. His 3 divisions would march north toward Sharpsburg with all speed. The captured garrison would be left under guard. The artillery and supplies would be sent to the rear. Light marching order, infantry and ammunition only. The march began at noon. Jackson's men covered 12 miles in 6 hours. They arrived at Sharpsburg by early evening. They were exhausted, hungry, coated in dust, but intact. 3 divisions, 14,000 men. Lee's army had nearly doubled in strength in a single afternoon. Lee had chosen the ground at Sharpsburg carefully. The town sat on a low ridge between the Potomac River to the west and Antietam Creek to the east. The creek was narrow, 30 to 40 feet wide in most places, but deep enough to require fording or use of bridges. 3 stone bridges crossed it: the upper bridge to the north, the middle bridge at the National Road, and the lower bridge, a narrow, arched structure to the south. The terrain between the creek and the town was open. Rolling farmland, large fields planted in corn and wheat, small woodlots, split rail fences, scattered farmhouses. Stone walls ran along property lines. The ground offered no significant strong points, but it was open enough for maneuver and observation. Artillery could be deployed effectively. Infantry could see advancing enemies at a distance. Lee deployed his forces along a north-south line west of Antietam Creek, approximately 1 mile east of Sharpsburg. Longstreet's corps held the center and southern portion of the line. Brigades were positioned in a sunken farm road that ran north-south for approximately half to a mile. The road, worn down by decades of wagon traffic, formed a natural trench. Infantry occupying the road would have cover and clear fields of fire across open ground to the east. Jackson's divisions, arriving throughout the evening of September 15 and morning of September 16, occupied the northern portion of the line. They deployed west of a 40-acre cornfield near a small white building, Dunker Church, a meeting house for a local German Baptist congregation. Artillery was placed on commanding ground throughout the line. Lee's artillery chief, Colonel Stephen Dill Lee, positioned batteries to cover all approaches. Confederate gunners had clear fields of fire across Antietam Creek and the ground beyond. The Potomac River lay less than 2 miles behind the Confederate center. There was one ford, Boteler's Ford, south of Sharpsburg. If defeated, the Army's only escape route would funnel through a single river crossing. Lee accepted this risk. He had chosen ground that favored defense but offered no fallback position. If McClellan broke through, the Army of Northern Virginia would be destroyed. By the evening of September 15, Lee's force at Sharpsburg numbered approximately 26,000 men. McClellan's and Walker's divisions were still marching from Harper's Ferry. They would arrive sometime on September 16. Anderson's division was recovering from South Mountain. Major General A.P. Hill's division was still at Harper's Ferry, securing prisoners and captured supplies. Lee's total strength, once all columns reunited, would approach 40,000 men. McClellan's Army of the Potomac numbered 75,000 effectives. McClellan arrived on the afternoon of September 15. His lead corps, Hooker's I Corps, reached the eastern bank of Antietam Creek at 2 p.m. They observed Confederate forces deploying on the opposite ridge. Skirmishing began almost immediately. Artillery exchanged fire. Neither side advanced. McClellan established his headquarters on the eastern ridge, overlooking the Avery's Creek. From there, he could observe most of the Confederate position. He studied the ground through field glasses. He consulted maps. He questioned local civilians about roads, fords, terrain. He estimated Confederate strength at 80,000 to 100,000 men. This was a significant overestimation. Lee commanded fewer than 30,000 men on September 15. But McClellan's intelligence provided by Pinkerton's detectives based on counting campfires, observing dust clouds, and interrogating prisoners consistently inflated enemy numbers. McClellan decided to wait for his entire army to arrive before attacking. September 16 passed without major engagement. Both armies continued deploying. McClellan's corps arrived throughout the day. Mansfield's the 12th Corps reached the field by mid-morning. Sumner's 2 Corps arrived by noon. Burnside's 9th Corps, recovering from South Mountain, moved into position south of the Middle Bridge. Porter's V Corps arrived and was held in reserve. Confederate reinforcements arrived as well. McClellan's divisions reached Sharpsburg by mid-afternoon. Walker's division arrived by evening. Lee's strength increased to approximately 38,000 men. Artillery fire continued throughout the day. Shells arced across Antietam Creek in both directions. Casualties were light. Both armies were probing, positioning, preparing. McClellan refined his plan throughout the day. The attack would come in 3 phases. First, Hooker's 1 Corps, reinforced by Mansfield's 12 Corps, would attack the Confederate left at dawn. The objective was the high ground near Dunkerchurch. If successful, this attack would turn Lee's left flank and force him to commit reserves to that sector. Second, once Lee weakened his center to reinforce his left, Sumner's 2 Corps would assault the Confederate center. The objective was the sunken road. Breaking through there would cut Lee's line in half. Third, once Lee weakened his right to reinforce the center, Burnside's 9th Corps would cross the lower bridge and strike the Confederate right flank. The objective was Sharpsburg itself. If Burnside succeeded, he would cut Lee's line of retreat to the Potomac. The plan required coordination. Each corps commander needed to attack in sequence, applying pressure where Lee had weakened his line to reinforce elsewhere. If timed correctly, Lee's smaller force would be stretched to breaking. The orders went out on the evening of September 16. Hooker was to cross Antietam Creek after dark, deploy his corps north of the Confederate left, and attack at dawn. Mansfield was to position his corps in support, ready to reinforce Hooker once the attack began. Sumner was to hold his corps ready to advance against the center on McClellan's order. Burnside was to position his corps opposite the lower bridge, ready to attack on McClellan's order. Porter's corps would remain in reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough. The army settled into position as darkness fell. At 5:30 a.m. on September 17, 1862, Hooker's artillery opened fire. The Battle of Antietam had begun. The fighting in the northern sector began in darkness and escalated through dawn. Hooker's I Corps numbered approximately 8,600 men organized into 3 divisions. They had crossed Antietam Creek during the night and deployed north of the Confederate left. At 5:30 a.m., Hooker's artillery, 6 batteries totaling 36 guns, opened fire on Confederate positions near Dunker Church. The barrage lasted 30 minutes. Confederate artillery responded. For half an hour, shells crossed above the intervening ground while both armies waited in the darkness. At 6 a.m., with first light breaking, Hooker ordered his infantry forward. The advance moved south through open ground toward a 40-acre cornfield. The corn planted in spring, now fully grown, stood 7 feet tall. Rows ran north-south. Visibility inside the field was measured in feet. Confederate Infantry Brigadier General Alexander R. Lawton's division waited in tree lines on the cornfield's southern edge. Hooker committed Brigadier General Abner Doubleday's division first. 3 brigades, approximately 3,000 men. They entered the cornfield in line formation, flags marking their positions above the corn. Confederate artillery on high ground near Dunker Church opened fire with canister. The range was less than 400 yards. Canister rounds, tin cans filled with iron balls, burst above the cornfield, shredding the corn and the men moving through it. Union soldiers fell by the dozens. Survivors pressed forward. At the cornfield's southern edge, Lawton's infantry rose and fired a volley. The Union advance staggered. Return fire began. For 10 minutes, both sides exchanged volleys across the cornfield, at ranges under 50 yards. The noise was overwhelming, continuous, deafening. Smoke obscured visibility. Men fired blindly into the smoke, reloaded, fired again. Hooker committed his 2nd Division. Brigadier General James Brewerton Ricketts' division, another 3,000 men entered the cornfield on Doubleday's right. Confederate resistance intensified. Jackson committed additional brigades. Brigadier General John Bell Hood's Division 2 brigades from Longstreet's corps, approximately 2,000 men counterattacked from the woods south of the cornfield. The cornfield became a killing ground. For the next 3 hours, control of that 40-acre field changed hands 15 times. Union brigades advanced, Confederate brigades counterattacked. Artillery from both sides fired into the corn indiscriminately. The stalks were cut down as if by scythe. By 9 a.m., most of the corn was gone, trampled, burned, or destroyed by shellfire. Casualties were catastrophic. The 1st Texas Infantry entered the cornfield with 226 men. They emerged with 82% casualties in 30 minutes. The 12th Massachusetts Infantry lost 67% of its strength, 224 men out of 334 inches the cornfield fighting. Hooker committed his 3rd Division. Brigadier General George Gordon Meade's division advanced through the east woods, attempting to flank the Confederate position. Confederate reinforcements met them. The fighting spread into the woods. Regiments engaged at close range among the trees. Visibility dropped to yards. Units became intermingled. Command and control broke down. At 7:30 a.m., Major General Mansfield's the 12th Corps entered the battle. Mansfield, commanding approximately 7,000 men, advanced to support Hooker's stalled attack. His lead division moved through the woods east of the cornfield. At 7:45 a.m., Mansfield rode forward to observe his troops' deployment. He was shot in the chest by a Confederate sharpshooter. He fell from his horse. He died within hours. Command passed to Brigadier General Alpheus S. Williams. Williams reorganized the corps and resumed the attack. 12 corps brigades pushed into the cornfield from the east. The Confederate line bent. Jackson committed his final reserve, Brigadier General Jubal Anderson Early's brigade. Early's men counterattacked through the cornfield. Union forces recoiled. By 9 a.m., the fighting in the northern sector had reached a stalemate. Both sides were exhausted. Ammunition was running low. Casualties exceeded 10,000 men in 3 hours. Neither side could advance. The fighting shifted south to the Confederate center. At 9 a.m., Major General Edwin V. Sumner's 2 Corps began its advance. Sumner commanded 3 divisions totaling approximately 15,000 men. McClellan's orders were to assault the Confederate center once the northern attack had drawn Confederate reserves in that direction. Sumner moved forward aggressively, too aggressively. His lead division, under Major General John Sedgwick, crossed Antietam Creek at 9:15 a.m., and advanced directly toward the Confederate center in tight column formation. Sedgwick's division, 3 brigades, approximately 5,400 men marched in 3 parallel lines, each line 300 yards behind the other. The formation was compact, easy to control, but vulnerable. Confederate forces in the center, Major General D.H. Hill's division occupied a sunken farm road that ran along a low ridge for approximately half a mile. The road, worn down over decades by farm wagons, was 3 to 4 feet below the surrounding ground level. It formed a natural trench. Infantry occupying the road had cover and clear fields of fire. Hill had deployed 5 brigades in the road, approximately 2,500 men. They waited as Sedgwick's division advanced across 400 yards of open ground. At 9:30 a.m., Confederate infantry in the sunken road rose and fired. The volley struck Sedgwick's lead brigade at 50 yards. Men dropped in rows. The brigade halted, returned fire, attempted to advance. Confederate fire continued. The brigade could not close the distance. Sedgwick's 2nd Brigade moved up to support. Before it could deploy, Confederate brigades that had been hidden in woods to the north emerged and struck Sedgwick's left flank. The division was caught in a crossfire. Confederate infantry fired into Sedgwick's lines from 2 directions. Federal soldiers broke and ran. Within 15 minutes, Sedgwick's division lost 2,200 men, more than 40% casualties. The division retreated in disorder back across Antietam Creek. Sumner committed his 2nd Division. Major General William Henry French's division, approximately 5,700 men, had been advancing behind Sedgwick but diverged south toward the sunken road. French deployed his brigades and attacked the Confederate center directly. The fighting at the sunken road, later called Bloody Lane, lasted 3 hours. French's brigades attacked in sequence. Each advanced across open ground, took heavy fire, reached the road, engaged in close-range firefight. Confederate defenders had clear fields of fire. Union soldiers had no cover. Casualties mounted rapidly on both sides. At 10:30 a.m., French committed his final brigade. Brigadier General Max Weber's Brigade 4 New York regiments advanced toward the center of the sunken road. They reached within 30 yards before Confederate fire drove them back. Sumner's 3rd Division entered the battle. Major General Israel B. Richardson's division, approximately 4,000 men, advanced south of French's position. Richardson deployed his brigades along a low ridge 200 yards east of the sunken road. From there, his men engaged Confederate defenders in a grinding firefight. For 90 minutes, both sides exchanged volleys. The range was close, often under 100 yards. Casualties were continuous. Men fell, were replaced, fell again. Ammunition ran low on both sides. Confederate defenders began pulling cartridges from dead men's cartridge boxes. At noon, Union forces identified a weakness in the Confederate position. The sunken road turned slightly at its center, creating an angle. From that angle, Confederate defenders were exposed to enfilading fire from the Union line. Richardson's men concentrated fire on that section. Confederate casualties spiked. The 6th Alabama Infantry lost 60% of its strength in 20 minutes. At 1 p.m., the Confederate center broke. Brigadier General Robert E. Rhodes, commanding the Confederate brigade at the angle, attempted to reposition his men to avoid the enfilading fire. In the confusion, he gave an order to withdraw. The order was misinterpreted as a general retreat. The brigade abandoned the sunken road. Adjacent brigades, seeing the withdrawal, followed. Within minutes, the entire Confederate center was falling back in disorder. Union forces surged forward. They occupied the sunken road. They advanced beyond it, pushing west toward Sharpsburg. The Confederate line had been broken. A gap existed between the northern and southern portions of Lee's army. If Union forces exploited this breakthrough with fresh troops, Lee's army would be split and destroyed. McClellan had reserves. PortersV.com. Corps, approximately 12,000 men, waited east of Antietam Creek, uncommitted. McClellan did not commit them. He believed Lee still commanded a force equal to his own. He feared a counterattack. He feared exposing his army to defeat. He ordered Richardson to halt and consolidate his position. The breakthrough was not exploited. Lee, meanwhile, scraped together reserves from every available source. Artillery batteries were redeployed. Cavalry was dismounted and sent into the line as infantry. Every available man was committed to plugging the gap. The line stabilized. The fighting shifted south to the Confederate right. At 1 p.m., Major General Ambrose Burnside finally began his assault on the lower bridge. Burnside commanded IX Corps, approximately 12,000 men. His orders, received the previous evening, were to cross the lower bridge and attack the Confederate right once the center and left were engaged. Burnside had been slow to act. His corps had been in position since dawn but had not moved. The lower bridge was a choke point. The structure was 125 feet long, 12 feet wide, built of stone with 3 arches. It crossed Antietam Creek at a point where the banks were steep and the water deep. Fording was difficult. The bridge was the only practical crossing point for a large force. The bridge was defended by approximately 400 Georgia infantrymen from Brigadier General Robert E's brigade. They occupied rifle pits and stone walls on the bluffs overlooking the bridge's western end. From those positions, they could fire directly down the length of the bridge. Any force attempting to cross would be exposed to direct fire for the entire 125-foot length. Burnside ordered a frontal assault. At 10 a.m., the 11th Connecticut Infantry attempted to storm the bridge. They advanced in column down the road approach, deployed into line at the bridge's eastern end, and charged across. Georgian defenders opened fire. The 11th Connecticut suffered 40% casualties crossing the bridge. Survivors reached the western bank, but could not advance against Confederate positions on the bluffs. They withdrew. At noon, the 2nd Maryland Infantry and 6th New Hampshire Infantry attempted a coordinated assault. Both regiments were repulsed with heavy losses. For 3 hours, repeated Union assaults failed. Burnside made no attempt to ford the creek upstream or downstream. He focused all efforts on the bridge. At 1 p.m., Burnside committed the 51st New York Infantry and 51st Pennsylvania Infantry simultaneously. Both regiments charged the bridge under covering fire from Union artillery. The 51st New York reached the western bank first, followed closely by the 51st Pennsylvania. Together, they stormed the bluffs. Georgian defenders, low on ammunition and outnumbered, withdrew. At 1:30 p.m., the lower bridge was in Union hands. Burnside's corps began crossing. It took 2 hours to move 8,000 men and artillery across the narrow bridge. By 3:30 p.m., Union forces had formed on the western bank and begun advancing toward Sharpsburg. The Confederate right consisted of approximately 3,000 men remnants of D.H. Hill's division and Toombs's brigade. They could not stop Burnside's advance. Union forces pushed west across open farmland. By 4 p.m., they had advanced nearly a mile. Sharpsburg lay less than half a mile ahead. Lee's line of retreat to Boteler's Ford was threatened. The Confederate army was collapsing. And then, at 4:30 p.m., Major General A. P. Hill arrived from Harper's Ferry. Hill had departed Harper's Ferry at 7:30 a.m. that morning. His orders were to secure the captured garrison and follow Jackson north. Hill decided the security could be left to a single brigade. He force-marched his remaining 5 brigades, approximately 3,000 men, 17 miles to Sharpsburg. His men marched in light order. Rifles and ammunition only, no packs, no blankets. They covered 17 miles in 9 hours. Hundreds fell out from exhaustion. Those who remained were driven forward by urgency. They could hear the battle from miles away. Hill's lead brigade, Brigadier General Maxcy Gregg's South Carolinians, reached the battlefield at 4:30 p.m. Hill deployed them immediately into the path of Burnside's advance. Burnside's IX Corps, advancing west toward Sharpsburg, was exhausted and disorganized. Regiments were intermingled. Command structure had broken down. Ammunition was low. When Hill's brigade struck their left flank without warning, the effect was devastating. Union soldiers, believing all Confederate forces were already engaged, were unprepared for a fresh attack. Gregg's men fired volleys into Burnside's flank at close range. Union regiments recoiled. Hill committed his remaining brigades. The Confederate counterattack drove Burnside's corps back toward the bridge. By 5:30 p.m., Burnside's advance had stalled. His corps fell back to defensive positions near the lower bridge. The assault had failed. Darkness ended the battle. By nightfall on September 17, 1862, the battlefield was silent. Casualties exceeded 22,000 men. Union losses numbered approximately 12,400, 2,100 killed, 9,500 wounded, 800 missing. Confederate losses numbered approximately 10,300, 1,550 killed, 7,750 wounded, 1,000 missing. It remains the bloodiest single day in American military history. Neither side had won. Lee's army had held its ground, but barely. Every reserve had been committed. Ammunition stores were depleted. Artillery batteries were down to their last rounds. Supply wagons had not arrived. The army had suffered losses it could not replace. 1/4 of the men who fought on September 17 were casualties. The invasion of Maryland had failed. Lee could not advance. He could not remain in position. Withdrawal was inevitable. McClellan's army had driven Lee to the edge of destruction, but not over it. Every attack had stalled or been repulsed. The breakthrough at Bloody Lane had not been exploited. Burnside's assault had been late and poorly coordinated. Porter's entire corps, 12,000 fresh troops, had never entered the battle. Opportunity had been lost. On the morning of September 18, Lee's army remained in position west of Antietam Creek. McClellan did not attack. Throughout the day, both armies tended their wounded. Burial parties moved across the battlefield. Ambulances evacuated casualties. Artillery was repositioned. Ammunition was redistributed. But no fighting occurred. Lee used the day to assess his options. Reports from division commanders were grim. Longstreet's corps had lost 1/3 of its strength. Jackson's divisions were at half strength. Hill's division, arriving late, was the only formation capable of sustained action. The Army's ammunition situation was critical. Many regiments had fewer than 10 rounds per man. Artillery batteries had exhausted their long-range ammunition. Reinforcements were not available. No additional Confederate forces existed in the region. The Army had to fight with what remained or withdraw. That night, Lee held a council of war with his corps commanders. Longstreet advised withdrawal. Jackson argued for holding position one more day to allow stragglers to return and wounded to be evacuated. Lee decided on withdrawal that night. At 9 p.m. on September 18, the Army of Northern Virginia began crossing the Potomac at Boteler's Ford. The crossing was orderly but slow. The ford was shallow, waist-deep, but narrow. Infantry crossed in column. Artillery and wagons moved slowly, wheels sinking into mud. The process took all night. By dawn on September 19, the last Confederate units had crossed into Virginia. The Maryland campaign was over. McClellan did not pursue. His cavalry crossed the Potomac on September 19 and skirmished with Confederate rear guards, but withdrew after brief contact. McClellan's infantry did not follow. The Army of the Potomac remained at Sharpsburg for a week, resting, reorganizing, receiving supplies. President Lincoln arrived at Sharpsburg on October 1 to meet with McClellan. He urged McClellan to pursue Lee immediately. McClellan cited insufficient supplies, exhausted troops, need for reorganization. He did not cross into Virginia in force until late October, more than a month after Antietam. Politically, the battle was a turning point. Lincoln had been waiting for a Union victory, however narrow, to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He had drafted the document in July, but his cabinet advised waiting for a military success to avoid the appearance of desperation. Antietam, though inconclusive militarily, was claimed as a Union victory. Lee had invaded the North and been driven back. On September 22, 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The document declared that all slaves in states still in rebellion on January 1, 1863, would be forever free. The war's objective formally expanded beyond restoration of the Union to include abolition of slavery. European powers, particularly Britain, abandoned any consideration of recognizing the Confederacy. Militarily, the battle resolved nothing. Lee had been stopped but not defeated. His army withdrew intact, reorganized, and remained a threat. McClellan had won the field but not the campaign. The war continued. The lost order was never recovered by Confederate forces. The copy found by Corporal Mitchell remained in Union hands. After the war, it was deposited in the National Archives, where it remains today. No explanation for the loss was ever officially recorded. Theories exist, but none are conclusive. The most common theory attributes the loss to an administrative error in D.H. Hill's headquarters. Hill repeatedly claimed he never received a copy of Special Order 191 directly from Lee's headquarters. He stated he learned of the plan through verbal briefing from Jackson, his immediate superior for the Harper's Ferry operation. Lee's staff insisted a copy had been prepared and sent to Hill. The discrepancy was never resolved. If a copy was sent to Hill and he never received it, it could have been lost in transit by a courier or misplaced by Hill's staff. If it was lost by Hill's staff, it could have been discarded with other papers when the division moved from Frederick. Another theory suggests the order was lost by a staff officer who used it as wrapping for cigars, then carelessly discarded it. This theory has limited evidence beyond the fact that the order was found wrapped around cigars. A third theory suggests the loss was deliberate Confederate sabotage or Union espionage. This theory lacks any documentary support and is generally dismissed by historians. The identity of the officer who lost the order was never determined. Corporal Barton Mitchell received no formal recognition during the war. He was not promoted. He received no medal. After the war, he returned to Wayne County, Indiana, resumed work as a laborer, married, and raised a family. He rarely spoke of finding the order. When asked in later years, he provided brief, factual accounts without embellishment. He died in 1868 at age 29 from injuries sustained in a farming accident. Captain Peter Kopp, who verified the order's authenticity, survived the war and returned to Indiana. He received no recognition for his role. He died in 1872. The question remained, what if the order had not been lost? If Special Order 191 had remained secret, McClellan would have advanced from Washington more cautiously. He would not have known Lee's army was divided. He would not have known Confederate forces were separated by 30 miles. He would not have pushed aggressively through South Mountain on September 14. He would have moved slowly, probing for contact, unwilling to commit without clear intelligence. Jackson would have taken Harper's Ferry without interference, perhaps as early as September 14. Lee's columns would have reunited without crisis. The Army of Northern Virginia would have concentrated at full strength, rested, supplied. If McClellan eventually advanced toward Hagerstown, he would have met a concentrated Confederate force of 55,000 men in strong defensive positions. The battle, if it occurred, would have been fought on different ground, at a different time, under different circumstances. Lee might have chosen terrain more favorable to defense. He might have avoided battle entirely, maneuvering north into Pennsylvania to threaten Harrisburg or Philadelphia. McClellan, facing a concentrated enemy of unknown strength, might have hesitated indefinitely. Or the order might not have mattered at all. McClellan received Special Order 191 at noon on September 13. He did not move until dawn on September 14, 18 hours later. He engaged at South Mountain but did not break through until evening. He reached Sharpsburg on September 15 but did not attack until September 17, 2 full days later. 4 days elapsed between finding the order and engaging Lee decisively. 4 days in which Lee learned of the loss, accelerated operations at Harper's Ferry, concentrated his forces, and chose his ground. Even with perfect intelligence, McClellan moved cautiously. His belief that Lee commanded superior numbers shaped every decision. He committed forces piecemeal, He withheld reserves. He failed to coordinate attacks. He allowed Lee to shift troops from quiet sectors to threatened points. These decisions were McClellan's, not consequences of the lost order. The Battle of Antietam was not decided by a single document. It was decided by the decisions made over 4 days by both commanders. Lee's willingness to stand and fight despite being outnumbered. Jackson's speed in reducing Harper's Ferry. Hill's delaying action at South Mountain. AP. Hill's forced march from Harper's Ferry. McClellan's caution despite holding numerical superiority. The lost order created opportunity. It did not guarantee success. What remains is the document itself. A single sheet of paper, folded around 3 cigars, dropped in a field outside Frederick. A piece of paper that should never have been lost, should never have been found, should never have mattered as much as it did, but it did matter. It shaped the campaign. It forced Lee's hand. It gave McClellan knowledge he otherwise would not have possessed. It led, through a chain of decisions and battles, to the bloodiest single day in American history. And then it was filed away, stored in archives, examined by historians, studied by generations seeking to understand how one lost order changed the course of a war.